Welcome everybody to GoLocal Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. A little bit of news to start off. First, today is the 2-month anniversary of Rhode Island's first case. Since then, nearly 300 have passed away, and we've recorded nearly 8,000 positive cases. Obviously, the number of actual cases is substantially higher than that. We have a jam-packed day on GoLocal Live. We're going to go to Italy, to Bolzano, Italy in 1 second. But also today is Hall of Famer, our meteorologist, maybe the most beloved media person in Rhode Island, John Giorsi. He'll be Skyping in. Then we'll have Dr. Fine with some updated numbers. There was a revamping of data in Rhode Island, raising a lot of concerns about how viable the data is. This is the second or third different change in the past week. A lot of confusion, a lot of concerns about what the data the state is producing. Then we'll have Governor Raimondo's briefing at 1, and Scott Credici, one of the original founders of GoLocal, sports guru extraordinaire. He'll be talking about what's going on in the world of sports. So jam-packed day. Let's go to Rebecca Couto da Silva in Bolzano, Italy. Thanks so much, Rebecca, for joining us.
Thanks as always for having me.
Yeah, it's great. So let's go to it. Lots of things going on in Italy. Probably the most important one was everyone there was expecting a major relaxation of the restrictions across the country. Tell us what's going on and how the restrictions are and are not being relaxed.
So people are, I think, pretty upset because we don't have what was expected. For example, the document that you need, the self-declaration that you need to be able to leave your house is still with us. They're thinking of making a mobile version, or they've made one, but that is still pretty heavy for a lot of people. But basically, so the idea that you can't leave your town except for an enumerated number of reasons is now becoming you can't leave your region for the same reasons. But it's really unclear if, for example, you're allowed to go to a store that's not the closest store. So there was this restriction that if you have a grocery store near you, you can't go to the organic grocery store a block past it. And so it's not clear whether that's lifted or not. So what does it mean that you can go around the region if you still have to go to the closest of everything?
And the expectation was this May 3rd, May 4th deadlines was going to be a major relaxation after being locked down since the very beginning of March, right? Yes.
And so what happened is they open up a certain number of businesses. And actually, the press in Italy now is the most feminist I've ever seen it, because I think that something like 72% of the workers allowed to return to work on Monday are men. And there's this sort of awakening of all of a sudden you're saying, but there are no women in charge of making the rules. Now it's only men going back to work, or majority men. So people are very upset about that. A big deal is coming down to hairdressers and like I've brought this up before, but animal groomers have been put in with hairdressers. And so you see that it's like, well, hairdressers makes a lot of sense. There's a very close interpersonal contact. And an animal groomer really just needs to pick up the animal, have the animal dropped off. And so the people are saying these rules make no sense, right? You've got all people working in beauty lumped together, but we're not all having the same risk of contact. Other things that happen is you're allowed to visit family members, not grandparents because of the age factor risk, but you're allowed to visit family members, but like with masks and maintaining social distancing. So it's like, what 2 4-year-old cousins are going to abide by rules, right?
A lot of protests, you say?
Yeah, so for example, all the barbershops opened for an hour in Trento earlier this week, I believe in Bolzano yesterday or 2 nights ago. And then region by region, they're making different rules. So the country is saying you're allowed to open this, and regions can have more restrictive rules. Kind of like equivalent to our constitutional system, right? Like the federal government can make rules and then the states can be more restrictive. And the states are saying, so for example, where I live, they're saying, nope, pretty much everyone opens up on May 11th, which happens to be my birthday. So I was like,
Happy
freedom.
birthday.
Thank you. But hairdressers, dog groomers, restaurants, bars, everything, almost everything is opening May 11th. I think, not saunas, not group workouts, not hotels, but pretty much everything else. And so the country is saying, no, that's not valid to open. So there's likely to be a showdown. Our region is not the only region. I think there are dog groomers already working in other places, restaurants opening in other places. Veneto, which contains Venice, was very successful with its initial measures. So it's kind of just saying, well, we know what's best. So it's a patchwork now. The rebellion is sort of everywhere, and it's interesting.
Yeah, and Venice is, we were just there in September of 19, and Venice is a tourism mecca. So, as soon as Venice opens, some folks will want to come back and experience Venice. So that'll add further complications if there's not strict travel restrictions.
Yeah, and so, for example, they're talking about putting plexiglass up in a lot of places, and it's like bars and restaurants are just like, we don't have the space for that. We need a certain number of euros coming in to be successful, and the social distancing restrictions that are foreseen for the summer won't allow us to sell enough food, because you have to have this plexiglass and you have to have this, and the spacing at the beach. They're talking about putting up barriers at the beach, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so it's...
Well, you're better off than here in Rhode Island. The governor has functionally ordered all the summer events closed down for this year. Newport Jazz Festival and Folk Festival, and the very famous, I think longest running 4th of July parade, the Bristol Parade, has been canceled as well. The reality is, though, Italy's approaching 28,000 deaths, and while the number of deaths have declined, it's not a precipitous drop. It just seems to be edging down slightly. Is that what's driving the country's concerns?
Yeah, I think it's got to be really difficult to be the centralized government, because you've got these regions that are really hard hit, and it's a sense if you give an inch, people will take a mile. So, and then also just not be unfair. Like one thing that is very different in the US and Italy is the idea that if a store was closed, you couldn't sell any of that stuff anywhere else. So for example, like I said, the stationery store, okay, you can't buy paper and pens in the general store, or maybe the most boring pens possible if you need them to survive, right? But nothing really special or unique. You can't buy yarn. There's all this crafting time. You can't buy yarn because it would have been unfair to the small shops. And on the state level, that's happening too. You're saying, well, we've got to have the restrictions that are best for Lombardy, because otherwise it's unfair to them if everyone else can open up and they can't. So is that the right approach, or is it the right approach to let local governments say, well, we're seeing this pattern of deaths and we know how to govern our population? So it's not an easy choice for anyone involved. And I wouldn't want, I think it's pretty easy to throw stones at the central government when you don't have to worry, if you're the provincial government here, you don't have to worry about what's going on in Lombardia.
Right. Economic data that's come out across the world about first quarter GDP showed Italy being hit harder than any other country in the EU. Is that creating frustration as well?
Yeah, people are frustrated. People, are hungry. There's a lot of the so-called, I'm searching for a good euphemism for it, but the untaxed economy, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And right, like that's ground to a halt. That all the industries that are closed, a lot of the industries that are closed involve those workers, and so people are legitimately very hungry. We have already talked about how the mafia is starting to trying to reassert influence in areas where people don't have money for food, and yeah, Italians are feeling very, and this is the season to get everything back because Italy has this huge tourism economy.
Right.
Just Venice. And you're familiar with Venice. How do you socially distance when
Impossible.
Yeah, the streets are so thin. Same with Verona. A lot of places have just thin streets. How can you socially distance with a thin street like that?
And the experience with a piece of plexiglass is not anything I want to go and pay for to travel across the world to go and see. I mean, it's all so authentic, it's historic, you touch it and you feel it. It's going to be a very, very difficult time to get tourists to come back and experience it, coupled with sort of this viewpoint around the rest of the world that the Italian healthcare system may not be in certain regions as robust as it should be. So I think that adds some complexity to it. Let's go to your life. How's this week been? Has it been any different than last week? And do you expect, with at least some level of relaxation of the restrictions, for life to change and get any more, any better?
Yeah, I'm going to head down the mountain this week coming up, starting on May 4th, to get cat food and sweep in as many other purchases as possible because we still have the one cat with us, and you don't just change animals' diet. So I have the privilege or the ability of going to the closest place, which is in Bolzano. I'm less worried about doing that because it'll be during phase 2. I think that there's more of an idea that yes, you can go get what you need. Another thing that happened is that you can go get takeout. So it's not just that you call the place and they bring it to you, but you can actually go pick up takeout, which means that you could get a cup of cappuccino, which is very important in Italy. So I think that this coming week I'm going to have my first cappuccino in a very long time. I actually have a milk foamer at home, but I forget the word for this in English. The machine that translates the European energy into American energy is that short-circuited, so I haven't made any at home. So I'll get a cappuccino, I'll go down, but any parent homeschooling their child is not going to have a lot of freedom to change anything because it's a full-time job being a teacher. That's why teachers work the way they do. And as many handouts as they can give us, if they're not, on the screen 6 hours a day, then there's work for parents to do. Our district just started up with telelessons, live sort of lessons. They did the test on Thursday, and they'll start with school next week. But it's definitely there's not much room for change when you're needed at your homeschooling job.
There's a lot of news coverage over what Sweden has been doing and how it took a very different approach. Is that being debated as well in Italy? The Swedes went really for herd immunity right from the get-go. Yes, they've had more cases and deaths than Norway and Finland, but when you compare a country of Sweden size 10 million to, say, Massachusetts, they have a third less deaths than Massachusetts and a third less cases, and they think they'll have herd immunity by the end of May. Is there discussion about that in Italy?
Well, Lombardy is 10 million people, so it's pretty much the size of Sweden. And one country I don't think a lot of people look at is Portugal, which I believe is also 10 million, which did pretty severe lockdowns and has got pretty great numbers in terms of not losing people, not having a lot of spread. But I think that because phase 2, I think everyone was willing to wait for the end of phase 1, right? This is our lockdown. We've got to stop lower the curve. When phase 2 was published, and it was like, whoa, this is like kind of phase 1, 1.1,
Yeah,
not,
right.
not even 2.5, it's like 1.1. I think that has prompted people to look more at Sweden, but Italy was, pretty unique among Western countries to experience coronavirus before putting the measures in. Before, we were first in Europe, basically. And
Right.
so we got the deaths before the measures. Other places could at least look at us and be like, oh, we should implement the measures. And maybe they didn't, and then they got deaths before measures. But we were really the first country in Europe to be kind of slapped upside the head with these deaths. Then the measures came second. And it was much more of a surprise. In the UK, they said, it's not going to be like that. We'll go for herd immunity. Then they got these awful numbers. And they said, okay, we're going to lock down.
Right.
So I think that people here really appreciate how awful it is when it goes out of control. And I think that people are also thinking that population density has a lot to do with it. So Sweden is just perhaps able to do what it can do because it doesn't have the density. So I think people aren't necessarily saying, oh, we should be like Sweden. There's definitely a group, and that group is growing now that phase 2 is looking much less permissive than it was. But I think that people appreciate that Sweden is a small country, that Stockholm may be one of the only places where you have these contacts, and we know what happens when it flies around.
Yeah,
places
absolutely.
like
Rebecca, before we go, what else should Americans know about developments in Italy?
I would just really keep an eye out for when the borders are going to open up again, because people want tourists to come. And I can't give a firm date on that, but the pizza's still great. It's actually fantastic because there's so much less of it. So the ingredients are super fresh. But the food is great. Everything is still great here, and people really want to get back to normal. And hopefully we can do that in a safe way and welcome the tourists in when they're able to come.
Rebecca Couto da Silva, thank you so much once again. It is just, it's a great perspective, and folks really look forward to it here in Rhode Island. There's so many Italian Americans here in Rhode Island. I think it's just this nice connection while we're all suffering through this. Thank you so much. For everybody else, stay tuned. John Giorsi, Hall of Famer, coming up shortly. Then Dr. Michael Fine, Governor Raimondo's briefing, and Scott Credisci. So a busy day. Thank you for tuning in, and please stay safe.